Today is the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights March in Selma, Alabama, which was vividly portrayed in the movie Selma. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had put out a call to clergy around the country to join in this event. Approximately 500 Unitarian Universalists, including nearly 1/5 of all UU ministers, responded to his call. In the movie, it shows a white minister being savagely beaten with clubs by several white Southerners. What few people know, and what was not stated in the movie, is that this man was Reverend James Reeb, in that photograph, a Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston, married and with 4 young children. He was the first white person killed in this fight for justice. Reeb's death inspired a wave of nationwide protests and calls for federal action. Another Unitarian Universalist who responded to this call was Viola Liuzzo, also killed. In a way that few deaths do, the murders of these 2 activists helped change in the course of history. Now we will hear a portion of Dr. King's eulogy to Reverend Reeb, examine the role that Unitarians have played as a force for social justice, now and in the past, and discuss our personal experiences and views concerning racial equality. Following recent incidents with the police and black citizens, and new voting law restrictions in some southern states, it is critical to support our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, and for justice, equality, and compassion in human relations.
Good morning.
Good morning.
While it is a privilege to read the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it is also somewhat daunting. So I invite you to visualize the Reverend, and if you want in your own mind to hear his voice, because he spoke as no one else can. Dr. King's eulogy for Reverend James Reeb. Quote, "And if he should die, take his body and cut it into little stars. He will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night." These beautiful words from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet so eloquently describe the radiant life of James Reeb. He entered the stage of history just 38 years ago, and in the brief years that he was privileged to act on this mortal stage, he played his part exceedingly well. James Reeb was martyred in the Judeo-Christian faith that all men are brothers. His death was a result of a sensitive, religious spirit. His crime was that he dared to live his faith. He placed himself alongside the disinherited black brethren of this community. The world is aroused over the murder of James Reeb, for he symbolizes the forces of goodwill in our nation. He demonstrated the conscience of a nation. He was an attorney for the defense of the innocent in the court of world opinion. He was a witness to the truth that men of different races and different classes might live, eat, and work together as brothers. James Reeb could not be accused of being only concerned about justice for Negroes away from his home. He and his family lived in Roxbury, Massachusetts, in a predominantly Negro neighborhood. They devoted their lives to aiding families in low-income housing and low-income districts. Again, we must ask the question, why must good men die for doing good? So the Reverend James Reeb has something to say to all of us in his death. Naturally, we are compelled to ask the question, who killed James Reeb? The answer is somewhat simple and rather limited when we think of the who. He was murdered by a few sick, demented, and misguided men who have the strange notion that you express dissent through murder. There is another haunting, poignant, desperate question we are forced to ask this afternoon that I asked a few days ago as we funeralized James Jackson. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? When we move from the who to the what, the blame is wide and the responsibility grows. James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a taillight rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has moved down the path of demagoguery, who has fed his constituencies the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. James Reeb was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff and law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of law. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam, yet cannot protect the lives of its own citizens seeking constitutional rights. And yes, he was even murdered by the cowardice of every Negro who tacitly accepts the evil system of segregation, who stands on the sidelines in the midst of a mighty struggle for justice. So in his death, James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike, says that we must substitute courage for caution, says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy which produced the murder. His death says to us that we must work passionately, unrelentingly, to make the American dream a reality so that he did not die in vain. So, in the darkness of this hour, we must not despair. We must not become bitter, nor must we harbor the desire to retaliate with violence. We must not lose faith in our white brothers who happen to be misguided. Somehow we must still believe that the most misguided among them will learn to respect the dignity and worth of all human personalities. We thank God for the life of James Reeb. We thank God for his goodness, that he was willing to lay down his life in order to redeem the soul of our nation. So I say, as Horatio said, as he stood over the dead body of Hamlet, "Good night, sweet prince. May the flight of angels take thee to eternal rest."